Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 10 minutes. In this week's Climate Curious, we're pulling the emergency brake on the climate crisis and talking black carbon. Hundreds of times more potent than CO2 pollution, but only lasting a couple of weeks in the atmosphere. Could reducing this super pollutant be an immediate solution to slowing down climate change, improving health, and saving lives? On what are the most effective black carbon solutions, here's Oxford University and the internet's own science expert and YouTube content creator, Simon Clark. Stay curious.
So black carbon is a bit of a super pollutant. It's a short-lived pollutant in the atmosphere that very effectively absorbs sunlight and then heats its surroundings. Because it's black, it absorbs all the light that's incident upon it, and in that way, it is several hundred times more potent than CO2 when it comes to heating the local atmosphere in the short term. So the key thing about black carbon is that it doesn't last for long in the atmosphere. The typical lifespan in the atmosphere is a week or two, after which it falls out of the atmosphere. But whilst it's airborne, it heats the atmosphere. When it drops out of the atmosphere, it then lands on surfaces, and in particular onto snow and ice, and heats those surfaces, resulting in localized heating. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that about 0.1 degrees of warming to date can be directly attributed to black carbon. So it's not on the same order of magnitude as CO2, but it's a hugely significant, arguably maybe the second most significant short-term heating agent in the atmosphere that represents an amazing opportunity, because if you can target black carbon emissions, because it's so short-lived in the atmosphere and because it's so potent, you can have an outsized impact on global temperatures over a very short period of time. So it represents something of an emergency brake when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And additionally to the climate impacts, it's also hugely negatively impacts human health. So it's estimated that just in India, if you were to reduce black carbon emissions, you could save 400,000 lives per year. And that's people who would otherwise die from circulatory or respiratory diseases, heart conditions, and also leading to lower birth weights and affecting pregnant women. So huge health and climate impacts. The difference between long-lived and short-lived warming agents is a bit like the difference between a sprinter and a marathon runner. A marathon runner would be like CO2 in the atmosphere. It lasts for a really long time, centuries if not millennia in the atmosphere, and it doesn't necessarily have a very potent warming effect over a short period of time. Because it lasts in the atmosphere for a really long time, that means that the overall warming impact is large, in the same way that a marathon runner might not be running particularly quickly, but because they're running for such a long time, they cover a great distance. Whereas a sprinter, which would be, in this analogy, something like black carbon, but also other things like methane, may not last in the atmosphere for particularly long, but they have an outsized warming impact. They're much more potent. So a sprinter might not be running for a particularly long time, but they're running very quickly. And so the long-lived agents will ultimately have the larger warming impact, but the short-lived agents in the atmosphere are the more directly addressable ones. The short-lived agents in the atmosphere represent a huge opportunity. If you can reduce their emissions rapidly, then you see a rapid impact on the climate. Whether that's with methane, you see the impact in a decade or two. With black carbon, you see it in a couple of weeks. Versus if you tackle CO2, you don't see the cooling impact of that for decades, if not centuries. So short-lived agents are like the emergency brake on the climate. The majority of the heating that we've experienced to date comes from carbon dioxide. We have the best part of a degree Celsius that's come from warming directly attributable to carbon dioxide. You then have a few tenths of a degree that are attributable to methane emissions. And then you have about 0.1 of a degree Celsius that's directly attributable to black carbon. So much as this is about an order of magnitude smaller than CO2, because it is so much more actionable and because you can have a faster impact on temperatures by a rapid reduction in emissions, it's worth addressing, and that the numbers sort of belie actually how important this is. And it's black carbon is simultaneously an atmospheric pollutant with health impacts and a climate pollutant. And it's kind of been bounced between the two sides, really, like both sides playing hot potato with the issue of reducing black carbon emissions in such a way that actually we haven't made huge progress, or as much progress as we need to. So I think there's this common misconception that black carbon is just soot. To give you the technical definition, black carbon is a type of fine particulate matter caused by the incomplete combustion of various things, notably wood, coal, and waste. And part of black carbon is soot. Soot refers to black carbon that is very small, so between a tenth of a micron and a micron across, so PM 2.5, again, to use technical language, pollution. And that's the stuff that goes into the atmosphere, travels a really long way, and is typically formed in high temperature combustion. And it's associated with things like diesel engines. That's, however, only part of the picture, because you also have char. So char is black carbon that has a larger particle size. So it's between 1 and 100-ish microns. And because it's so much larger, this is the stuff that gets deposited much closer to where it is burned. So it doesn't ring around the world. And it's formed in lower temperature combustion. So typically associated with burning biomass or charcoal. So black carbon is more than soot. Soot is part of it. China more than halved its emissions of black carbon from 1995 to 2017 by focusing on the char part. So you're not actually talking about soot, but you're talking about the larger particle size stuff. And it's this huge drop-off specifically in that type of pollution. Depending on where you are, you have different sources of black carbon. So if you're in a high-income country like in Europe or in North America, about 70% of black carbon emissions come from diesel engines. So diesel engines produce soot rather than char, because they have heavy fuel molecules, and the engines rely on fuel atomization that often results in incomplete combustion in a way that petrol cars don't as much. So it's diesel engines specifically that leads to most emissions in high income countries. In lower and middle income countries, between 60 and 80% of emissions actually come from residential, so household, solid fuel being burned. So that's coal and that's biomass, which typically happens in low temperature combustion, which results in more char than soot. So there's this interesting disparity between the type of black carbon that you're seeing based on where you are in the world. Global emissions of black carbon, we think, have been relatively slowly falling. It's not as fast as we would like it to be, but we're certainly heading in the right direction. The largest emitters when it comes to black carbon are China, India, and then Indonesia and Nigeria. So it's basically the large population centers in middle income countries. But it's worth noting that China actually more than halved its emissions of black carbon from 2.6 megatons in 1995 to about 1.3 megatons back in 2017. It's continued to drop. And that has overwhelmingly been caused by a focus on char. So that's the large particle size of black carbon. And the way that they did that was by focusing on domestic solid fuel being burned at a low temperature. You could argue that really the world should be primarily focused on the char side of black carbon and reducing open stoves being used and biomass being burned at a low temperature. Another way that you can do that is electrification. So if you electrify heating and if you electrify transport, then you completely reduce tailpipe emissions of transport. And that's something that is particularly relevant when it comes to high-income countries like in Europe. Fortunately, diesel sales in Europe are actually in a very long-term decline, and with the rise of electric vehicles, that looks set to continue. So the largest source of black carbon in developed economies is actually directly being addressed by electric vehicles. More broadly, you have to look at the picture when it comes to low-income countries, because much as we're trending in the right direction in middle and high-income countries like China and in Europe, there's this risk that the gains that we've made there are going to be outweighed by increased use of fuel in low-income countries. One of the very specific solutions comes from how people in low-income countries currently cook their food. A lot of cooking is done at low temperatures, in open fires or in stoves in households. And that has a bunch of negative connotations. For one thing, it's inefficient, and there are ways that you can do the same amount of cooking for less fuel. And given that most of the fuel is coming from biomass that often comes from deforestation, if you were to replace a inefficient open cook stove with a clean closed cook stove, then you reduce the amount of deforestation that's happening around the world. So it's one of these examples of the polycrisis, meaning that if you're attacking one part of the crisis, you're actually attacking lots of different parts, because you're not only reducing black carbon emissions, you're reducing deforestation. Additionally, you're also reducing indoor air pollution, which is a massive killer around the world, killing millions of people around the world because of respiratory diseases, strokes, heart conditions. If you were to reduce the amount of air pollution indoors, you suddenly reduce the burden on the healthcare system. And this is something that has been touted as a solution for a little while. It's probably worth saying that there's also a gender angle to this. That if you're implementing a climate solution that is attached to cooking specifically, when it comes to especially low and middle income countries, that has a disproportionate positive impact on women, because women have traditionally fulfilled that role in the household when it comes to cooking, but also getting the fuel to light the fires, lighting the fires, tending it, having the negative health impacts of standing over the fire, as well as doing all the childcare in the house. And so this ties into the idea of the clean energy transition being a just transition. And as simple a thing as bringing in a cleaner burning cook stove, you have positive impacts socially, in terms of health, in terms of deforestation, and in terms of the climate. So in summary, black carbon is a really underlooked super pollutant. It has such a short lifespan in the atmosphere, but has such an outsized warming impact that by addressing it rapidly, we have so many wins to gain. We have wins to gain in terms of preventing the warming of the planet, preventing deforestation, preventing negative healthcare outcomes. And the good news is we are moving in the right direction. And at the moment, emissions are decreasing, and we have great solutions that we know work. We just need to make people aware of them, increase the rate that we are rolling them out, and enforce those legal standards that we have seen work in places like China, elsewhere in the world. Because we have the solution, we know that it works, we've just got to do it and keep doing it and do it faster.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time,
stay curious.